Hello and welcome to this other module of the RISKSUR Training series on animal health surveillance. This lecture focuses on diseases that are present in a given area and provides notions on surveillance strategies for case detection and disease frequency estimation, illustrated by some examples. My name is Arianna Comin, and I am a research epidemiologist at the Swedish National Veterinary Institute in Uppsala, Sweden. I hope you will enjoy this lecture. In this module, you will be guided through some topics, namely, what are the patterns of disease occurrence, what are the surveillance options when a disease is present in an animal population in a given area, what are the surveillance strategies when the primary objective is to estimate disease frequency and when the objective is to detect cases of disease, implication of controls versus eradication, and finally, a brief summary of the key concepts. In the previous module, you have been guided through the process of demonstrating freedom from disease, which apply in the welcome condition of disease absence. Under this circumstance, you would obviously expect to have no cases of disease. At some point in time, it might happen that few cases are introduced in your free population, and depending on the disease and other epidemiological determinants, they might fade out spontaneously. It might, however, occur that the number of cases keep increasing, giving rise to an epidemic. And after a while, due to natural disease progress or to external actions, the number of incident cases might stabilize and the disease become endemic. If you take specific actions to reduce the level of disease, you might end up with less and less cases over time and hopefully be free again. This module focuses on disease presence at any level or frequency of occurrence. Before going ahead with this lecture, I wish to state a disclaimer about the term disease. Strictly speaking, disease refers to the clinical manifestation of some infection, infestation, or health condition. However, for the sake of simplicity, along this presentation, I will use the term disease to imply both clinical manifestation and underlying infections or conditions. When a disease is present in an animal population in a given area, there are several options to deal with it. To decide which is the most appropriate one, stakeholders refer to priority setting, which, beyond socioeconomic and political factors, is driven by the level of disease occurrence and the impact of such disease on animal and public health. Depending on the priority setting, there are different actions that one might take, including doing nothing, in case, for instance, of a sporadic occurrence of a poorly contagious disease, disease control, to reduce the level of an endemic or epidemic disease which might cause financial losses or threaten human health, or even disease eradication. After your actions have been implemented, one might want to assess that they have been effective, as well as that the priority setting is still appropriate. The level of disease occurrence indicates the proportion of cases of disease and is normally measured using prevalence or incidence. To know the level of disease occurrence, one might need to rely on surveillance activities aiming at estimating disease frequency. Control and eradication imply that some actions are taken to reduce or eliminate the disease from the population. The first step in taking actions against a disease is to identify the cases, meaning the epidemiological units having the disease under investigation. Once the cases have been detected, they can be removed from the population, consequently reducing the prevalence of disease. Hence, disease control programs require surveillance activities designed for case detection. The level of disease is not constant over time, especially if actions are taken to reduce it. Detecting changes in disease frequency over time or space can help revising the priority setting. For instance, if the level of disease has increased over a certain threshold, it might require a control program which was not in place before. It can also help assessing the effectiveness of a control program by checking that disease frequency is actually decreasing. In both these cases, surveillance activities designed to detect changes in the level of disease are required. In summary, surveillance for diseases that are present in a given animal population in a given area can have two main objectives, namely estimating disease frequency, both to assess the level of disease and to detect changes in such a level over time, and finding cases of disease to put them under control. Let's start from the surveillance strategies to estimate disease frequency. When estimates of prevalence or incidence are required for priority setting and thus for decision making, surveillance must ensure reliable estimates of such epidemiological parameters. The key aspect to ensure reliable measure of disease frequency is to adopt a representative sampling strategy, meaning that the data generated must come from a sample representative of the population. Representative sampling can be achieved by sampling the whole population, which is usually unaffordable, or by taking a random sample. Here comes an example of random sampling. The little squares represent epidemiological units of a population. They can be animal or herds, depending on the disease under surveillance. Gray squares are healthy units, while yellow squares are disease units, meaning cases. If we plan to take a random sample of, let's say, 20 units, then we can pretty much expect that the prevalence in the sample is a good estimate of the prevalence in the population. Random sample can be also stratified. If, for instance, we know that the units are more abundant in the southern part of the country, we might decide to collect two sets of random samples, one in the north and one in the south, with the sample size being proportional to the unit abundance in the two strata. A stratification like this often applies when the sample collection is managed by local administrative units, for example. By taking a random sample within the strata, we can again expect that the prevalence in the sample is a good estimate of the prevalence in the population. As surveillance is expensive, as a matter of fact, is seldom designed with the primary goal of estimating disease frequency. What often happens is that disease frequency is estimated based on surveillance data already collected for other purposes, or that surveillance is designed with the primary goal of detecting cases, with the disease frequency estimation being only necessary when disease is found. When surveillance is designed for other objective, it might be optimized using, for example, risk-based sampling. In this case, and in any other case where the sample is not representative of the population, reliable frequency estimate must be extrapolated. Suppose that there is a surveillance in place with the main objective of finding individual cases of disease. To optimize the surveillance efforts in case detection, a risk-based sampling is adopted. Starting from these data, we want also to estimate the frequency of disease, as proposed by the author of this paper. By the way, this paper, as well as all of the sources that I'm going to cite within this lecture, are available in the download window below. Risk-based sampling, as we will see later on in this lecture, focuses on strata at higher risk of being infected or detected. This will maximize the chance of detecting cases, but will also generate a non-representative sample of the population. If we want to estimate disease frequency from a sample that is intentionally biased towards the disease part of the population, then we have to apply some method to correct it, like for instance the point value correction. The method proposed here allows the correction of biased data if two key epidemiological parameters are known, which are the risk ratio, which is the ratio between prevalence in the high-risk stratum and the prevalence in the low-risk stratum, and the risk fraction, which is the proportion of the population in the high-risk stratum. Go back to our former example. Suppose now that we are aware that the disease is more likely to be present in the western side of the country, because there is a lot of trade with the bordering country having a high prevalence of the same disease, for example. If the primary objective of surveillance is detecting cases, then we might decide to target the high-risk stratum only, increasing thus the probability of detection. As you can see, we have now doubled the number of cases detected compared to the random sampling example. However, the prevalence in the sample reflects the prevalence in the high-risk area and is not representative of the prevalence in the whole population. From previous investigations, we knew the prevalence in the two strata, so we can compute the risk ratio. We also knew the proportion of units at high risk, which in this example is 40% of the population living in the western side of the country. Therefore, we can calculate the point value of our sample using the formula displayed here, obtaining 2.1. What does this number mean? The point value represents the number of units that would have been needed to be randomly sampled from the entire population in order to detect 4 cases as we did. It means that in our example, we would have needed twice the sample size in order to detect 4 cases using random sampling. This value, computed from the relative risk and risk fraction, allows to scale the estimated prevalence from the risk-based sample, which refers to the risk population only, and derive the prevalence in the entire population. The main drawback associated to risk-based sampling when the ultimate objective is to estimate disease frequency is the need to acquire accurate information on risk ratio and risk fraction in order to debias the crude frequency estimate. This is particularly challenging when the disease is rare or the knowledge about population structure is vague, like for wildlife population, for example. The more uncertain those parameters are, the less efficient the point value adjusting method is, because the correction will lead to an over or underestimated prevalence of the general population. There are other ways to estimate disease frequency from suboptimal sampling strategies. In this example, surveillance for paratuberculosis in sheep flocks was in place with the objective of detecting cases to allow disease control. The surveillance system consisted of several components, among which abattoir testing. The authors used the data generated from abattoir surveillance to estimate the prevalence of disease. By definition, abattoir surveillance is biased towards a healthy animal and has imperfect sensitivity. Therefore, crude prevalence estimates from abattoir data are likely to be underestimates of the true prevalence in the whole population. In this paper, the authors derived the true prevalence of infected sheep flocks by using a Bayesian approach, adjusting for prior knowledge of the distribution of infected flocks and sensitivity and specificity of abattoir surveillance. In this other example, the authors designed a random sampling for estimating prevalence of Wojcicki disease, based on a comprehensive sample collection already in place to demonstrate freedom from swine vesicular disease. This smart way to optimize resources is also known as multi-hazard surveillance, but it works well as soon as the component providing the samples, which in this example was the sample collection for demonstrating freedom from swine vesicular disease, is representative and preferably comprehensive. Let's explore now the surveillance strategies to detect cases of disease. First of all, a case is defined as an individual or an epidemiological unit having the characteristics of the disease under investigation. The key aspect of surveillance for case detection is finding as many cases as possible. Therefore, it is normally continuous over time, like for instance routine abattoir testing, and preferably comprehensive. To achieve a higher coverage, it often involves multiple surveillance components. And when the prevalence of disease is relatively low, for example, after a successful disease control program has been in place for several years, risk-based approaches can be applied to improve the efficiency of case-finding surveillance. This, as already mentioned, involves the identification of subpopulations at higher risk of being infected and/or detected, where surveillance activity can be focused in order to increase the chance of detecting cases. Continuous surveillance means that surveillance activities are carried out continuously, like every day or every week, rather than periodically, like once a year. This is often done exploiting existing processes like slaughtering or testing for milk quality assurance. A particular example is passive surveillance, when applicable, which is an example of continuous surveillance since it's assumed to be in place every day. And furthermore, it is also comprehensive given that all the units can potentially be under surveillance. Here are just few examples of continuous surveillance activities that you can download from the download window below. Every surveillance activity targets a specific population under surveillance. which is usually only a fraction of the total susceptible population. By combining several surveillance components, we can increase the likelihood that one individual will be covered at least by one component. In this example of surveillance for bovine brucellosis, there were combined 5 different surveillance components targeting subpopulations like beef herds, dairy herds, slaughtered animals, and so on, allowing as a whole to cover the entire cattle population. And after a successful control program, we might expect that the number of new cases arising in time will be lower and lower. In this situation, risk-based surveillance can improve the case-finding capacity by targeting the surveillance efforts to the subpopulation at higher risk of being infected or detected. It is, however, important to remember that risk-based surveillance needs to be based on a solid risk assessment, because inappropriate risk definitions might lead to inappropriate allocation of surveillance efforts and possible waste of resources. Another thing to consider is that when the ultimate goal of surveillance is detecting cases to support eradication, then risk-based sampling focusing only on the high-risk strata will not suffice, given that it will disregard a part of the population where the cases, despite few, are still present. By disease control, we mean reducing the prevalence of disease in the population to a level where it is no longer a major health or economic problem. This is by definition compatible with the existence of a limited number of cases still present. On the other hand, disease eradication, in case it will be achievable, aim at a complete elimination of a disease from a population, meaning that both the clinical cases and the pathogen should no longer be present. Whenever surveillance for case detection will support disease control, then the priority is to maximize the likelihood of detection, to detect as many cases as possible. But when it will support disease eradication, then the priority goes to coverage, because all the cases need to be found and removed. Risk-based surveillance, focusing only on subpopulation at high risk, will increase the likelihood of detection and find as many cases as possible to lower the prevalence below the tolerance threshold, serving the scope of disease control. However, it will disregard a part of the population where the disease is still present, albeit with a lower probability, and therefore it will not allow to achieve eradication. Nevertheless, to improve the efficiency and timeliness of case finding for eradication purposes, high-risk strata might be subjected to more stringent surveillance compared to the low-risk strata. An example can be to sample units in the low-risk stratum once a year and those in the high-risk stratum twice a year, for example. We are now towards the end of this lecture, and here is a recap of the main concepts that we approached. When disease is present in a given area, surveillance can be put in place with the primary objective of estimating disease frequency or to detecting cases. Frequency estimation is required to set up priority setting and to assess the effectiveness of control, while case detection is required as a support for control or eradication activities. It follows that surveillance for frequency estimation must ensure reliable estimates, and surveillance for case detection must be comprehensive of the susceptible population. As for the optimization of surveillance, in case of frequency estimation, it can be carried out ad hoc, meaning once, or periodically, like once a year. It should preferably be based on representative sampling, and it should use a large enough sample size to achieve adequate precision in the estimates. And when it comes to case detection, surveillance can be ongoing or periodic, if the infectious period is long or transmission rate is low, could benefit from risk-based approaches, and should consist of several complementary surveillance components to increase coverage. In conclusion, here is a short checklist of optimal surveillance components according to the main objective of surveillance. Passive surveillance has a very high coverage, low cost, and is ongoing. Therefore, it is absolutely suitable for case detection. However, it might suffer from reporting bias, becoming less appropriate for frequency estimation. Abattoir surveillance has a high coverage and is ongoing, so again, it is suitable for case detection. However, it is representative of the healthy population only, and thus less appropriate for the frequency estimation. Sentinel herds are very good for early warning, but they have a very low coverage and they are not representative, so they are not suitable for any of the two purposes. Representative surveys are, as you would expect, representative, and therefore perfectly suitable for frequency estimation. On the other hand, they are often carried out once and only on a small proportion of the population, so despite they can carry the ability of detecting some cases, they are not the optimal choice for case detection. On the contrary, risk-based survey will increase the likelihood of detection, resulting then optimal for case detection. But they are also biased towards the disease population, so they are less appropriate for frequency estimation. Finally, syndromic surveillance, which works very well for early warning, is not suitable for prevalence estimation nor for case detection, because it refers to a syndrome and not to the specific disease under surveillance. I hope you did enjoy this lecture, and I thank you very much for listening.